I flew to New York without telling my son, and when I arrived, a sign on the door caught my eye. Its words are simple yet powerful. Honeymoon, do not disturb. In that moment I felt the world pause, for those words were more than a message. They were a gateway to something unexpected. I knew what lay behind that door was not just a surprise, but the beginning of a turn that would shape everything still ahead. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. I carried a restless heart that night, holding a secret decision to see my son without warning, for I believed a father has the right to surprise his child and share in his triumphs. But as the plane lifted from the tarmac and the lights of my city faded below, a quiet unease stirred within me, one I could not yet name. Hours later, stepping onto the bustling streets of New York, I felt both pride and anticipation, for I had poured decades of my strength, my sweat, and my hope into this boy, and in my mind he would welcome me with open arms, glad that I had made the journey. I remember the rhythm of my cane tapping the sidewalk as I walked toward the building he had so proudly told me about in a letter months before. A building he said would mark the beginning of a new chapter, and I smiled to myself, imagining his face when he saw me standing there. Unexpected yet familiar, like the return of a song half forgotten but never lost. The elevator ride up felt eternal, each floor passing like a test of my patience. And when at last I stepped into the long hallway that carried the scent of polished wood and quiet wealth, I stood before his door with my hand trembling not from age, but from excitement, and that is when I saw it, that small rectangular sign hanging from the knob, plain letters carrying more weight than the heaviest stone. Honeymoon, do not disturb. My breath caught, for the words were not meant for me, yet they struck me deeper than any spoken sentence could. In that moment I realized something had unfolded in his life without me, a chapter written where my presence had not been invited, and I stood frozen, as if the years of sacrifice and devotion had been quietly folded away into a drawer that no one opened anymore. The hallway was silent except for the pounding in my chest, and as I stared at that sign I felt memories rising unbidden. The days when I worked double shifts to keep food on the table, the nights when I mended torn shoes by lamplight so he could walk proudly into school, the sacrifices of my own youth traded away for his future. And now here I was, an old man in a strange city, standing at the threshold of a door that would not open for me. I told myself not to rush, that perhaps there was an explanation, that perhaps I would still hear his voice call out in joy when he discovered me waiting. But the sign remained, and its message was clear. And though my heart wavered between pride for the new life he must have begun and a gnawing ache that I had not been part of it, I knew the story of that moment would carry me into places I never imagined. You see, it is not the grand betrayals that break a man, it is the quiet revelations, the signs on doors that tell you where you stand without ever speaking your name. And so I remained there longer than I should have, my hand brushing against the smooth brass of the handle, whispering to myself that one day he would understand what it cost me to stand in that hallway, what it cost me to remain silent, when every part of me longed to knock and declare that his father had come all this way just to see his smile. That was the beginning, and though I did not yet know it, the sign on that door was not an ending, but the spark that would lead me down a path of discovery, sacrifice, and a reckoning that no one could have foreseen, not even me. When I think back to the moment I decided to go to New York, it was not planned in the way most travels are. It was a choice born from instinct, from a longing that rose quietly one evening as I sat alone in my chair, staring at the clock and wondering what my son was doing at that very hour, whether he was eating a meal, laughing with someone, or perhaps walking home through the streets I had never seen but had often imagined in my mind, and that thought carried me straight into motion. I rose, gathered a small bag, packed only what I needed, and told no one of my intention, for there are journeys in life that must be taken in silence, driven by something that cannot be explained until it is lived. As I booked the ticket and heard the confirmation number read to me, my heart beat with the kind of excitement I had not felt in decades, and I told myself that this was not just a trip, but a gift, a way to remind my son that his father, though aged and slower now, was still present, still able to cross the miles for him, still eager to see the life he had built. The morning of the flight, I walked into the airport with the same determination I once carried into factories and workshops when I labored for his schooling, for every step I had taken in my life had been for him. Every sacrifice bent toward the belief that if I gave enough of myself, he would have the freedom to dream without burden. As I sat in the waiting area, surrounded by strangers, I thought of the times when he was a boy and I carried him on my shoulders, when his small hands clutched my shirt as if I were the only anchor he had in the world, and I smiled, remembering the promise I made to his mother before she passed, that I would see to it our boy never went without, that he would have more than we ever did, that his road would not be broken by hardship as ours had been. The flight itself was long, but I filled the hours with reflection, staring out of the window as the clouds rolled beneath us, imagining his face when he saw me at the door, perhaps startled at first, but quickly softened by the realization that I had come all this way to celebrate whatever milestone he had reached. I thought of the letters he once sent me, filled with details about classes, jobs, and small victories, each one a thread tying me to his world even when distance kept us apart. And I believed that stepping into his life unannounced would only strengthen that thread, reminding him that he had not been forgotten by the one who gave him everything. Yet behind that hope there lingered a faint shadow, the memory of recent calls where his voice was shorter than before, where he mentioned little about his daily life, where I sensed the careful choice of words that comes when someone wishes to hide something. I brushed it aside, telling myself it was only the natural drift of adulthood, that as children grow they learn to keep more to themselves, but deep inside I wondered if there was more to his silence. When the plane finally descended and the lights of New York glimmered like a field of stars spread upon the earth, I felt my heart rise, for I was closer than ever to seeing him, closer than ever to stepping into the world I had imagined for so long. The cab ride to his address felt both endless and fleeting, the city alive with noise, horns, and hurried footsteps, a place that seemed to pulse with the energy of ambition and success. And I told myself with pride that my son belonged here, that he had taken the opportunities I fought to give him and turned them into a life worthy of admiration. By the time I reached his building, the hour was late, and as I stood outside its tall frame with my small bag in hand, I felt a swell of satisfaction that I had made the journey without hesitation, without doubt, because sometimes a father must go where his heart leads him, even if no invitation is sent, even if no words of welcome have been promised. And so I stepped forward, believing that behind those walls waited a moment of reunion that would heal the distance of years, unaware of the truth that hung quietly on the other side, waiting for me to discover it. The memory of that hallway has never left me, for it was there, in the quiet stillness of an unfamiliar building, that I came face to face with a truth I had not been prepared for. And though the walls were polished, and the air smelled faintly of varnish and new paint, it was not the surroundings that etched themselves into my mind, but the sight of that simple sign hanging from the door before me, a sign that read in firm, deliberate letters, Honeymoon, do not disturb. I remember stopping short, my cane tapping once against the floor as though it too had been stunned into silence. And I stood there with my hand inches from the knob, frozen between the impulse to knock and the hesitation that crept into my bones as I read the words again and again, trying to make sense of them. My son had never told me he was married. He had never spoken of a wedding. He had never once mentioned that he had chosen someone to share his life with. And here I was, hundreds of miles from home, discovering it not from his lips, not from a letter, not from a proud announcement, but from a sign on a door meant to keep the world away. My heart beat heavily in my chest as I thought back to the countless sacrifices I had made to give him the foundation for this life. The nights I worked long shifts while other men rested. The holidays I spent alone so he could have books and tuition. The silent meals I ate with little on the plate so he might eat his fill. And yet, when the moment came for him to step into this union, into this new beginning, I had been left behind. I leaned on my cane and tried to steady my breathing, telling myself there might be an explanation, that perhaps he had meant to tell me, but the words had not yet found their way across the miles. Perhaps he had intended a visit soon to introduce me properly. Perhaps the timing had simply slipped away from him in the whirlwind of love and change. Yet the sign spoke differently, for it carried not only the message of privacy, but also the evidence of how much I had been kept in the dark. And in that moment I felt a sting that was sharper than anger, a sting born of the realization that the bond between us, the bond I had nurtured with years of sacrifice, had not been strong enough to carry me into this part of his life. The hallway was empty, yet I felt the presence of unseen eyes, the imagined judgment of neighbors who might have walked past me and wondered why an old man stood there, staring at a door he had no right to enter, waiting for a welcome that might never come. I thought of his mother, how she would have wept with both pride and sorrow to see him take this step, and how she would have wanted to stand by his side, smiling as he promised himself to another. And I knew then that I carried not only my own disappointment but hers as well, her absence echoing in the silence of that hall. I did not knock, not yet, for I could not bring myself to break the illusion that perhaps he would open the door on his own. Perhaps he would emerge and see me standing there, surprise giving way to joy, as he realized I had traveled so far for him. Instead, I stood with my palm pressed against the cool brass of the handle, whispering words no one could hear, telling him that I was here, that I had come to witness his happiness, even if he had not asked me to. The sign remained still, swaying faintly as if mocking my hope, and in that stillness I felt the weight of all the years that had passed between us, the distance that had grown while I believed we were still as close as when he was a child. That was the moment the truth began to unfold before me, and though I could not yet see its full shape, I knew that nothing would ever feel the same again, for the door that separated us was more than wood and brass. It was the measure of a life lived apart from me, a life I had given everything to build, yet had not been invited to share. When I stood in that hallway, staring at the sign on the door, what rose up in me more than surprise was memory, for a father cannot separate the present from the long road that carried him there. And in that moment, my mind drifted back across the years to the sacrifices that shaped my son's life. Sacrifices I had made quietly, without complaint, believing they would one day be honored in the simple form of love and respect. And it is only when you look back that you realize just how much a man can give of himself when his heart belongs entirely to his child. I remembered the nights when he was only a boy, and winter crept in through the cracks of our old house, when I would give him my blanket and sit by the fire with my coat wrapped around me. shivering but content because his small body slept warm and safe, and I told myself even then that his comfort was worth every ache in my bones. I thought of the years after his mother passed, when grief sat heavy on both of us, and how I forced myself to keep moving, to put food on the table, to keep him in school, to hide my tears until he had gone to bed, because I knew that if he saw me break, the little strength he had left might crumble too, and so I carried his pain alongside mine and shouldered it without letting him know how deep the burden went. There were the long hours at the factory, when machines roared and sweat soaked my shirt, when men half my age grew tired, but I pressed on, knowing that every dollar earned meant another book for his studies, another chance for him to climb higher than I ever could. And though my back ached and my hands grew calloused, I never once regretted it, because each scar was a step on his path. I recalled the day I sold the only heirloom I had from my father, a watch that had ticked through generations, because tuition came due and there was no other way. And though it pained me to part with it, I told myself the timepiece would live on in another form, in the future I was buying for my boy, in the life he would build that would carry our name forward. I gave up evenings with friends, opportunities to remarry, chances to start anew, because my devotion to him was absolute, because I believed that to raise a son into a man of worth was the greatest purpose a life could hold. I thought of the little joys, too, the way he smiled when I brought home his first bicycle, even though it meant I ate bread and broth for weeks, the pride in his eyes. When he showed me a report card filled with good grades, the sound of his laughter echoing through our small home as he practiced jokes he had heard from classmates. And in those moments I felt rich beyond measure, convinced that the sacrifices were not losses but investments in a bond that would never break. Yet as I stood before that door in New York, with the sign declaring a life I had not been invited to witness, I felt all those years wash over me with a strange mixture of pride and sorrow, for I had given so much without ever asking in return. And now I found myself wondering if he remembered any of it, if he understood that every step he took had been paved with the quiet struggles of his father. A man can endure many hardships when he knows his efforts are not in vain, but the hardest test is silence, the kind that grows between parent and child when one forgets the other. And in that silence, I began to feel the weight of every sacrifice pressing down on me at once. Still, I would not take them back, for those sacrifices defined me as surely as they defined him, and no matter what sign hung on his door, I carried within me the certainty that I had done my part as a father, and that knowledge, though heavy, was also the only comfort I had left in that moment. As I stood in that hallway with the words "Honeymoon, do not disturb" still echoing in my mind, I began to understand the quiet puzzle pieces that had been laid before me over the past months, pieces I had not wanted to see clearly. For the truth was that neighbors had whispered, relatives had hinted, and acquaintances had let slip fragments of information that pointed to changes in my son's life, yet never once had he spoken of them directly. And now, in that silence, I saw what those fragments meant. I remembered how the neighbor across the street once mentioned seeing my son in the company of someone new, her tone carrying more knowledge than her words revealed, but I brushed it aside, telling myself that if it were serious, my boy would tell me in his own time. I recalled how an old cousin of mine asked during a family gathering if I had met my son's special someone, her eyes glinting with curiosity, and I smiled politely while changing the subject, embarrassed to admit that I had not even heard such a person existed. Over and over these small moments played in my mind, and I realized now that people around me had known, that others had been privy to truths that I, his father, had been kept from, and that bitter silence was the clearest message of all. It is not the absence of words that wounds a man, but the choice to withhold them. The deliberate gap between what is said and what is lived. And in that gap I felt myself slipping into a place I had never known, a place where the sacrifices of my years seemed to echo without reply. I thought back to evenings when I sat by the telephone waiting for his call, convincing myself that perhaps he was busy, that work demanded his time, that the city was a place that consumed hours quickly. And yet, beneath those excuses lay the deeper truth that he was already moving into a life he chose not to share with me. Even the letters that once arrived with eager handwriting had slowed, replaced by short notes or quick calls that carried little of the warmth I once knew, and now I could see it all with clarity, the careful distance he had been building, the silence that grew not from accident but from intent. As a father, I had always told myself that, no matter what, there would be honesty between us, that even if the truth was hard, it would always be better than silence. Yet here I was, learning the most important chapter of his life from a piece of cardboard hanging on a door. The hallway seemed colder the longer I stood there, the lights above humming softly as if mocking my stillness. And I realized that the bitter silence was not just in his absence, but also in my own voice. For I had not demanded answers when I should have. I had not pressed him when I sensed distance. I had allowed the silence to grow because I believed love alone would keep us close. It is a cruel lesson for an old man to learn that love, though strong, cannot always survive unspoken truths. And in that moment I felt the sharpness of being excluded not by chance, but by choice. Still, even as bitterness touched my heart, I reminded myself that silence is not final, that it can be broken, that words can still be spoken if one has the courage to ask. And so I resolved that I would not leave that hallway without knocking, that I would not let the silence define us forever. But before I lifted my hand, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, letting the memories of our life together fill me, letting the weight of the sacrifices and the pride I still carried steady my spirit. For I knew that whatever awaited on the other side of that door, I had to face it as a father who had given everything, and as a man who would not let silence rob him of the truth any longer. In that hallway, before my hand finally rose to knock on the door, I found myself replaying the moments that had led me here, those faint stirrings of suspicion that had crept into my heart long before the truth revealed itself on that small sign, moments I had ignored because a father always hopes his child's distance is temporary, that the bond of blood will close any gap with time, but now I saw them clearly and they told a story I had not wished to hear. I remembered the evenings when I would call him, eager to hear his voice, eager to ask about his days in the city, only to be met with quick answers, replies clipped short, as though he were standing with someone else in the room, someone who did not want my words intruding into theirs. I remembered how, when I asked if he was seeing anyone, his voice would shift, light with amusement, yet never revealing detail, always turning the subject back to my health, my meals, my quiet routines, as though distracting me with questions about myself could prevent me from pressing further. There were times when he promised to visit but then delayed, citing work or responsibilities, and though I believed him, the look in his eyes on the rare occasions he did come home carried something different, a shadow of secrecy that lingered when he spoke of his life. I noticed how he no longer mentioned friends by name, no longer shared stories of colleagues or dinners, as he once did with enthusiasm, and instead kept his words vague, as though he were hiding something not shameful but simply not meant for me. And there was the evening when a letter arrived, written in his hand, yet strangely formal, thanking me for my support but offering no warmth, no stories, no glimpse into his world. And I held it for a long time, wondering what had changed. Each of these moments should have told me the truth, that he was under the influence of someone else, someone who wished to draw him away, to reshape his life without the old ties that bound him to me. And though I felt the sting of it, I convinced myself again and again that it was just a phase, that he was busy, that youth often brings distance before maturity draws children back to their parents. Yet the signs were there. Small cracks forming in the bridge between us, cracks I walked over with careful steps, unwilling to admit that one day they might break entirely. I recall the time I asked him directly if he was hiding something, and he smiled, a smile that seemed genuine yet did not reach his eyes, and he patted my shoulder as if to reassure me, saying only that everything was fine, that I need not worry. And though the words should have comforted me, they lingered in my mind like smoke, fading but never gone. The more I thought of it, the more I realized that suspicion had always been present, like a whisper in the corner of a room you pretend not to hear. But love blinded me. Love told me not to question too much. Love reminded me that trust is the foundation of fatherhood, and so I silenced my doubts and waited for him to share his truth. Now standing before that door, with Honeymoon do not disturb staring back at me, I knew those whispers had not been false, that the distance I had felt was real, that the influence of another had indeed turned his steps away from me, and I cursed myself quietly for not listening sooner, for not demanding honesty when I still had the chance. Yet, even as suspicion hardened into certainty, I reminded myself that I was still his father, that I still carried the right to seek answers, and that whatever waited on the other side of the door, I had earned the truth through every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every coin spent on his future. And so my suspicions, once ignored, now became my resolve, for I would not walk away from that hallway without facing the life he had chosen, even if it meant discovering that the place I held in his heart was not the place I had always believed it to be. At last I lifted my hand and let my knuckles rap gently against the door, the sound echoing faintly down the quiet hallway. And though it was a small gesture, it carried the weight of decades, for in that knock lay every memory, every sacrifice, every hope that had carried me to this moment, and I waited with my heart thundering in my chest, listening for the familiar voice of my son to call back to me with surprise and joy. Yet what followed was not what I expected. At first there was only silence, a pause so long I wondered if the apartment was empty, and I leaned on my cane, steadying myself with the thought that perhaps they had stepped out and the sign had been left behind. But then I heard footsteps approaching, soft yet deliberate, and my heart leapt, for I was certain it would be my son. The door opened only a fraction, just enough for me to see a sliver of the interior, the dim light behind, and the face that appeared was not my son's, but that of a stranger, a woman whose eyes were sharp and assessing, her expression neither welcoming nor curious, but rather guarded, as though she had been expecting someone she did not wish to see. I smiled gently, the way an old man does when meeting someone new, and I said in a voice that carried all my affection that I was here to see my boy, that I had traveled far to surprise him. Her gaze did not soften. Her lips did not curl into a smile. Instead, she studied me with a coolness that made the hallway feel colder. And after a moment she spoke, her words measured and clipped, saying that now was not a good time, that they were busy, that perhaps I should come back later. I felt a flicker of confusion, for a honeymoon should be a celebration, a moment of warmth and openness. And yet here I was, being met with a door barely opened and a tone that suggested intrusion. I tried again, telling her that I was his father, that I had raised him alone, that I had come with nothing but love in my heart and the wish to stand by him in his joy. But even then her expression did not shift, and I could feel the invisible wall she was placing between me and my son. I asked softly if I could simply see him for a moment, if I might offer a word of blessing, but she shook her head, saying he was resting, that he did not need interruptions. And before I could press further, I heard a muffled voice inside, a man's voice, my son's voice, though I could not make out the words, only the tone, and the woman glanced back briefly before closing the door a little tighter, leaving me with only a narrow view of the carpeted floor within. My heart ached at that moment, for I had expected my son to appear, to welcome me, to embrace me for the journey I had made. But instead, I was confronted by this stranger, who treated me as though I were an outsider with no rightful claim to the man I had raised. I stood there, trying to summon patience, telling myself that perhaps she did not yet know me, that perhaps her coolness was born of misunderstanding, yet deep within I sensed a truth I had not wanted to face, that she did not want me there, that she saw me not as a father but as an obstacle to the life she wished to build with him. The door remained mostly closed, and as I spoke again, asking if he might step out for just a moment, her response was curt, saying they needed their privacy, and the way she looked at me then told me I was not welcome, not now, and perhaps not ever. I stood rooted to the floor, my cane pressing into the carpet, my heart heavy with the realization that the confrontation I had hoped would be a reunion was instead a dismissal. And though I did not yet know the depths of what lay ahead, I understood that the battle for my place in my son's life had begun at that very door, in that brief meeting where love was met with coldness and a father was left standing on the threshold of exclusion. As I stood before that door, with only a sliver of space left open between me and the life my son now lived, I heard words slip through the narrow crack, words never meant for my ears, yet sharp enough to pierce deeper than any blade. For though muffled, they carried the tone of dismissal, the easy cruelty of voices that believed I was no longer needed, no longer relevant, as though the years I had carried him, the nights I had labored, the sacrifices I had made, were nothing more than dust to be brushed aside. The woman, whose eyes had already told me I was not welcome, leaned her head slightly toward the inside, and I caught the faintest exchange, my son's voice subdued, hers sharper, and in those low tones I heard the chilling truth, that to her I was a burden, an intruder, someone whose presence could only disturb the perfect new world she had imagined. And the cruelest part was hearing my son's silence in response, as though he agreed, as though he too had chosen to let me stand outside rather than rise to defend me. I cannot forget the sting of hearing her say, almost carelessly, that fathers had their time and their use, but once a man builds his own family, the old one must step aside. And though the words were not spoken directly to me, they carried across the narrow opening like a gust of winter air, freezing me in place. I felt my throat tighten, not from anger but from disbelief. For never in all my years had I imagined I would be spoken of as though I were a tool worn out, as though my love had an expiration date, as though my role had ended the moment another had taken his hand. I wanted to call out then, to tell my son of the years when I had given him everything, of the nights when I lay awake calculating how to stretch a single dollar into a week's worth of meals, of the times when I went without new shoes so he could walk proudly in his, of the moments when I chose solitude over companionship because my focus belonged only to him. But the words lodged in my chest, heavy and unsaid, because I realized that if he could hear her cruelty and not protest, then speaking would only reveal how far I had already been cast aside. I shifted my weight, my cane pressing deeper into the carpet of the hallway, and for a moment I considered knocking louder, forcing the door wide, demanding to see him face to face. But something in me held back, something that whispered of dignity, that told me a father must never beg for the love of his own child. The casual cruelty of those words played over and over in my mind, not shouted in anger, not cloaked in rage, but spoken as though they were a simple truth. And that quietness made them cut even deeper. For cruelty delivered without passion is cruelty that has settled into conviction. I stood there longer than I should have, my eyes fixed on the narrow gap, listening to the muted sounds within. And with every passing second, I felt the weight of invisibility, the realization that in their new life, I was already being erased. Yet even in that moment of pain, a fire began to stir in me, small at first but growing, for if they thought I was finished, if they believed my place in this world was over, then they did not yet know the strength that years of sacrifice can give a man, nor the resolve that builds in silence. I turned then, slowly, my heart heavier than it had ever been, and walked down that hallway with the memory of her words ringing in my ears, not defeated but awakened, for I understood at last that the bond I had relied upon was no longer enough. And if I wished to claim the dignity I had earned, I would need to show them that a father's place cannot be erased by casual cruelty, nor can his worth be measured by the blindness of those who forget what he has given. As I walked away from that door with the sting of those words still heavy in my chest, my mind did what all weary minds do when wounded. It returned to the past, to the moments that reminded me why I had endured so much, why every sacrifice had been worth it. And in that quiet walk down the hallway, I let the tide of memories wash over me, each one a testament to the devotion that had guided my life from the day my son was born. I remembered the first time I held him in my arms, a small bundle with eyes that seemed too wise for his fragile body, and how I whispered a promise into the air that I would never let him want for anything, not food, not shelter, not love, and that vow became the compass by which I navigated every hardship. When his mother fell ill and left this world far too soon, I became both father and mother, protector and provider, comforter and disciplinarian, and though the nights were long and the loneliness fierce, I never faltered. For in his small face I found the strength to keep moving forward. I remembered carrying him on my shoulders through crowded streets so he could see the world from above, his laughter ringing in my ears, and I remembered the way his hand would slip into mine at the end of the day, trusting me completely to guide him safely home. When money was scarce, I took on every job I could find, mending fences, lifting crates, laboring in factories, my back aching and my hands raw, but I did it all with a sense of pride, because each coin I earned meant another day of security for him, another meal, another pair of shoes, another book for his education. I remembered his schooling, how I stayed up late helping him with sums I barely understood myself, and how I studied alongside him by the dim glow of a single lamp, determined that he would have opportunities denied to me, determined that his mind would not be limited by the boundaries of poverty. There were moments when I wanted companionship again, when friends urged me to remarry, to seek happiness for myself, yet I turned them down, for I believed my happiness was already complete in the sight of my son's growth, that my devotion to him was the truest form of love I could ever know. I remembered the pride that swelled in me when he received his first acceptance letter to a school far from home, a pride so fierce it erased the fear of letting him go, And though I stood alone on the platform waving goodbye as the train carried him to his new life, I carried no regret, only hope that he would soar higher than I ever dreamed. Even in the hardest times, when illness struck me down or bills threatened to break me, I pressed on with a smile for his sake, hiding my weakness so he would never feel the weight of my struggles. And in those quiet acts of devotion, I built the foundation of the man he would become. I thought of all the birthdays I made special, with little more than homemade cakes and laughter, of the holidays where gifts were scarce but joy was abundant, because he knew that love filled the empty spaces where money could not. And I told myself again and again that one day he would look back and see what those moments meant. Yet standing there in New York, unwelcome in the life he had chosen, I realized that devotion is not always recognized, that sometimes the greatest acts of love are forgotten by those who receive them. And still I felt no shame, for my devotion had not been a transaction seeking reward. It had been the very purpose of my existence. As I left the building that night, I carried those memories like a shield, each one proof that I had done my part, that I had honored my promise. And though others might dismiss me, I knew the truth of what I had given, and that truth could never be erased, no matter how far my son strayed from the man who had raised him. As I stepped out into the night air of New York, leaving behind the door that had been shut against me, the weight of disappointment pressed heavy on my shoulders. Yet within that very heaviness something began to shift, for instead of bending me, it began to harden me, shaping itself into a quiet resolve that I had not known I still carried, a determination born not of anger but of dignity, the kind of strength that comes only after years of sacrifice and endurance. And I told myself that if they wished to close me out, if they thought they could erase me from the story of his life, they would soon learn what it means to dismiss a man who had given everything. I paused on the street corner, my cane steady in my hand, and I thought about all the years I had poured into building a foundation, not just of love, but of resources, the savings I had protected, the properties I had acquired through sweat and sacrifice, the accounts that had grown quietly while I denied myself luxuries so that one day he might stand upon solid ground. And I realized that much of what my son now enjoyed was not his alone, but had been given to him by me. A father does not speak often of these things, for love prefers to stay silent about its labors. Yet at that moment I saw clearly that the very life from which I had been excluded had been built upon the stones I had laid, and if they believed I could be dismissed like a guest overstaying his welcome, then they did not yet understand the depth of my resolve. I looked up at the glittering windows of the city, each one a small world of ambition and pride, and I vowed that I would not allow their casual cruelty to define my worth, that I would reclaim the dignity owed to me not by demand but by action, for actions are the language of fathers who have endured too long to waste words on deaf ears. The bitterness I had felt in the hallway did not vanish, but it transformed, turning into fuel, into the quiet fire that burned in me as I considered the steps I might take, the truths I might reveal, the choices I still controlled that could remind them that the old man they thought forgotten still held the power to shape their world. I told myself that I would not act rashly, that patience would serve me better than confrontation, for a storm does not announce itself with shouting. It gathers quietly, drawing strength until the moment it breaks. And in that patience I found comfort, because I knew my time would come. As I walked slowly through the streets, the sounds of the city rushing around me, I remembered the words of my own father long ago, that a man's strength is not measured by how loudly he demands respect, but by how firmly he stands when others try to take it from him. And I realized that this was the moment for me to stand, not with raised voice, but with steady will. My resolve was not born of vengeance alone, but of love. For even in my pain I loved my son. Even in my exclusion I carried the same devotion that had guided me all his life. But love without respect is a chain that binds a man to sorrow, and I refused to let myself be chained any longer. That night, as I returned to the small room I had rented, I sat by the window looking out at the restless glow of New York, and I whispered to myself that the time had come to act, to show them that a father cannot be erased so easily, that my sacrifices were not to be discarded, that my name and my place would be remembered whether they wished it or not. And in that whisper I found peace, for my resolve had been forged, and nothing they did from that day forward would ever bend me again. When I speak of resolve, it was not an empty word formed in the heat of my disappointment. It was grounded in something solid, something that had been quietly waiting in the background for years. For while my son built his life in the city and wrapped himself in the illusion of independence, the truth was that the very wealth he stood upon, the very comfort that allowed him to move so freely through the world, had its roots in the sacrifices and careful planning of his father, and it was time I admitted to myself just how much of his foundation rested in my hands. I had lived a life of quiet discipline, never squandering, never chasing luxuries, always mindful that tomorrow might demand more than today could provide. And through that discipline I gathered not just savings but properties, accounts, and investments that I managed with care, each one intended to ensure that he would never face the hunger or hardship I had once known. Many of those assets were never spoken of directly, for I believe that a young man should not grow entitled, that he should first learn the weight of earning before being handed the security of inheritance. Yet I had always intended for him to receive the fruit of my labor when the time was right, when he had grown into the kind of man who would respect what had been given. What he never realized, however, was how much of his current success had already been shaped by my unseen hand. For when he secured his first apartment, it was not solely through his earnings, but through a quiet sum I had arranged to reach his account, a sum he believed was the result of some fortunate bonus. And when he advanced in his career and found opportunities open to him, it was because I had called in favors with men who owed me from long ago, men who trusted my word and in turn extended chances to him without ever revealing where they had come from. Even the education that allowed him to rise above his peers had been financed not only by the visible wages I earned, but by the silent liquidation of assets I had guarded for decades, assets he never knew existed, because I wanted him to stand proud on graduation day without realizing the hidden sacrifices that had paved his way. And now, as I sat in that room overlooking the city, I counted in my mind the accounts still in my name, the deeds still under my control, the investments that still bore my authority, and I realized that while they might think me powerless, I held within my grasp the very strings that supported their comfortable lives. It was not vengeance that stirred in me, but a stern reminder that respect is tied to truth, and the truth was that he had not built all of this alone, that his new life, his marriage, his home, even the very walls behind which I had been refused, were entwined with my unseen hand. I felt no desire to destroy him, for he was still my son, still the boy I had carried and protected, but I knew then that I could not allow this blindness to continue, that he and his wife needed to understand that erasing me from their lives would not erase the foundations I had laid. Knowledge itself is power, and the financial truth was mine alone to reveal. And I told myself that when the moment came, I would lift the veil and show them the reality they had ignored, not with anger, but with the steady hand of a father who had given more than they could ever repay. In that moment I felt a strange calm settle over me, for the bitterness of the hallway gave way to clarity, and I knew that the strength I carried was not only in my heart, but also in the resources I still controlled, resources that would one day remind them of who I was and what I had done. And until then I would keep that truth close, letting it strengthen my resolve as I prepared for the steps ahead. In the days that followed, I moved with a silence that was deliberate, for I knew that rushing into confrontation would only serve their pride and confirm their belief that I was desperate to reclaim a place in their world. So instead, I turned inward and began the quiet planning that a man of my years knows best. The kind of planning that requires patience, discretion, and a steady hand. Each morning, I rose before the city stirred, sitting with a notebook in the small rented room, writing lists of the assets I still controlled, recalling every account, every property, every certificate tucked safely away. And with each item I wrote down, I felt my strength returning, because I saw clearly that I had not been stripped of power as they might have imagined. Rather, I was in possession of the very means to remind them of the truth. I visited old acquaintances, men of law and finance, who had once shared meals with me, men who knew the character of my labor and respected the discipline with which I had managed my affairs. And I asked quiet questions, never revealing the full depth of my intentions, only gathering the knowledge I would need when the time came. Documents were updated, signatures renewed, accounts reviewed with precision, and slowly I began to redirect ownership into forms that secured my control, ensuring that no careless hand, no entitled heir, could assume what had not been rightfully given. I found myself walking the streets of New York with a sense of purpose, my cane tapping against the pavement like the beat of a drum, each step a reminder that while they had sought to dismiss me, I was not idle. I was not powerless. I was preparing. In the evenings I sat by the window with papers spread before me, reviewing the paths I could take, weighing each choice with the patience that only age can grant. For I knew that to act rashly would be to weaken my position, and my aim was not to wound, but to teach, not to destroy, but to reveal the balance of power that had always existed beneath the surface. I remembered the look in the woman's eyes when she told me I was not welcome, and I realized that her confidence was born of ignorance of the fact that the life she had stepped into was not built by her hand, or even by my son's alone, but by mine. And it would take only one decision from me to show her how fragile their comfort truly was. I thought of my son, too, and my heart softened even in my planning. For though I had been hurt by his silence, I could not erase the years of devotion I carried for him. And I knew that whatever measures I took would need to balance justice with love, for a father cannot abandon his child completely, even when betrayed. Still, love without boundaries is weakness, and I had lived too long to let myself be reduced to a shadow in their lives. So I continued my quiet work, building a plan layer by layer, a structure of actions that would ensure my dignity was protected and that the truth would one day stand undeniable before them. When I laid my pen down at night and closed my notebook, I felt the steady calm of a man who has chosen his course, a calm that reminded me of the nights long ago when I mapped out how to stretch a small wage into food and rent, for planning had always been my way of survival, and now it was my way of reclaiming what had been dismissed. They thought me finished, an old man to be brushed aside. But in the silence of my room I knew the truth, that my quiet planning was the seed of a storm that would one day arrive at their doorstep, not with noise, but with certainty, not with vengeance alone, but with the undeniable reminder that a father's place cannot be erased. Once my planning had taken shape, I understood that the wisest course was not to confront them too soon, but to play along, to let them believe I had accepted my place on the margins of their new life. For there is strength in silence when it is chosen deliberately, and I resolved to wear the mask of a man beaten while quietly preparing the truth beneath it. When I saw my son in passing, or when word of his life reached me through distant relatives or brief messages, I allowed my responses to remain gentle and reserved, never pressing, never revealing the stirrings of my plan, for I knew that the more they believed me powerless, the less they would guard themselves, and in their complacency they would reveal what I needed to see. There is a strange art to pretending weakness, to lowering one's shoulders and bowing one's head so that others think you cannot rise again, and though it stung my pride at first, I found within it a deep sense of control, because every nod, every polite word, every silence I offered was a choice, and in that choice I was already winning. I remember one afternoon when I passed them in the street, my son at her side, and though his eyes flickered with discomfort when he saw me, she met me with that same coolness, and I smiled warmly, asking about their health, speaking as though I were nothing more than a kindly old man grateful for a moment's notice, and they walked away, believing they had seen a figure fading into the background, when in truth they had seen a performance, one I carried out with care. At night I thought of the power of appearances, how often in life people misjudge what they see, and I realized that letting them underestimate me was the greatest shield I could carry. If I had spoken boldly of my control over the accounts, the deeds, the wealth that still bore my name, they might have braced themselves, they might have prepared, but by playing along, by allowing them to think me broken, I was able to work undisturbed, gathering not only strength but also the evidence of their true hearts. And their hearts revealed themselves quickly, for when others spoke within earshot, when letters arrived mistakenly addressed, when whispers drifted through the family, I learned of the words they shared behind closed doors, mocking my sacrifices, calling me a relic of the past, boasting of the day when everything I had would be theirs without restriction. And each cruel remark did not wound me as they intended, but rather steeled my resolve, for nothing reveals the truth of people more than how they speak when they believe you are powerless. I played along in every sense, presenting myself as tired, as resigned, even as grateful for scraps of kindness, while within I carried the calm certainty that when the time was right, the mask would fall, and the truth would stand unshaken. It was not an easy role, for pride burns in the chest of every father, and to pretend humility when one's dignity has been trampled is a bitter task. Yet I endured it, reminding myself that patience is a weapon as sharp as any blade, and those who rush to claim what is not theirs will one day stumble over their own arrogance. As weeks passed, they grew bolder in their dismissal, speaking less to me, inviting me nowhere, leaving me in silence as though I had faded from their world, and I let them, for I knew that behind the silence I was gathering strength. The quiet smile I wore, the lowered eyes, the polite nods, all were part of a game they did not know was being played, and in that game I was not the pawn they imagined, but the player arranging the pieces. By playing along, I gave them the rope with which they would one day hang their own pride, And when that day came, it would not be I who revealed my power in anger, but they who revealed their folly in arrogance. While I continued to wear the mask of resignation, I devoted my days to gathering proof, for instinct alone would not be enough when the time came to confront them, and I knew that if I were to stand with strength, I would need the weight of evidence behind me, the kind that speaks louder than words and leaves no room for denial. I began with the letters, small fragments that reached me through relatives or were carelessly left behind, notes that revealed their intentions, speaking of what they believed they would soon control, boasting of the houses and accounts they imagined already belonged to them, as if my years of labor had been merely a waiting gift. I collected whispers, too, the kind that float through family gatherings when wine loosens tongues, when cousins speak too freely and reveal more than they should, and though I remained silent in their presence, I tucked every word into memory, returning to my room to write them down in careful detail. I sought out neighbors who had heard conversations through thin walls, who had seen the way she spoke to him with sharpness, the way he agreed in silence, and from their accounts, I pieced together the portrait of a couple who saw me not as a father or benefactor, but as an obstacle soon to be removed. In time I discovered even more, for old acquaintances in the financial world passed along papers that showed how inquiries had been made into my accounts, subtle attempts to uncover what was hidden, proof that they were already scheming to gain what was not yet theirs. Each discovery I filed carefully, keeping duplicates where no one could reach them, ensuring that no hand but mine could alter or erase what had been found. The process was slow, requiring patience, for I had to move with the quiet tread of a hunter, never revealing the trail I followed, never letting them suspect that the old man they dismissed was watching, listening, recording. At times, the task was bitter, for it is a cruel thing to read the words of your own blood mocking the sacrifices you made, calling them meaningless, claiming they were owed what you had built as if they had labored beside you in those long nights of sweat and struggle. But I forced myself to read and reread, for each word was not merely cruelty but proof that would one day stand against them and strip away the mask they wore. I remember the day I found the letter that cut deepest, a note written in her hand, speaking of how, once the inheritance was secured, they would cut ties entirely, how they would move on without the weight of family holding them back. And though the words pierced me like a blade, I held that paper with steady hands, knowing it was not only an insult but a key, a piece of undeniable evidence that revealed their true designs. Gathering proof gave me strength, for with each page, each whispered account, each careless word captured, I felt my position grow more secure, and I knew that when the moment arrived, I would not stand before them with only my pain, but with the truth in tangible form. Even as I walked the streets of New York, I listened for echoes of their voices, for chance remarks that slipped through the noise of the city, and time and again I was rewarded, for arrogance makes people careless, and they spoke too freely, believing the old man was blind, deaf, and harmless. Yet I saw, I heard, I recorded, and I prepared, and though they thought me powerless, I carried in my hands the very weapons that would one day shatter their illusions. Proof is patience rewarded, and I gathered it with the same devotion I once gathered wages for his schooling, knowing that just as those coins once secured his future, these words and papers would one day secure my dignity. When at last my collection of proof was secure, and my planning had been refined to the smallest detail, I knew it was time to set the stage. For a reckoning is not something that bursts forth in anger, but something carefully arranged so that when the curtain rises, there can be no doubt about the truth. The setup began with quiet calls to the lawyer, who had long handled my affairs. A man who had known me in my younger years when I built my holdings brick by brick, coin by coin, and who respected me enough to listen closely when I explained that the time had come to bring clarity to matters others had misunderstood. Together we reviewed every document, every deed, every account, ensuring that the ownership was clear, that signatures were unshakable, that the law itself stood behind me. And once those foundations were confirmed, I asked him to prepare for a meeting. Not an ordinary one, but a gathering in which both my son and his wife would be present, seated together to hear truths they could no longer deny. I arranged it with care, never revealing my intentions, framing the invitation as a discussion about the future, about the orderly transfer of responsibilities, knowing that the very suggestion of inheritance would draw them eagerly to the table. For their own words had already betrayed how much they longed to claim what was not yet theirs. In the days leading to it, I rehearsed the steps in my mind, picturing their faces when they realized the ground beneath them was not theirs to stand on, picturing the moment when their arrogance would give way to shock, and I felt not bitterness but calm anticipation, as though I were a craftsman preparing the final stroke of a work long in progress. To ensure no detail was overlooked, I had witnesses quietly arranged, men of law and family, who would observe not only the documents but the behavior of those who sat across from me. For truth is not only written on paper, but revealed in the words people choose when their illusions collapse. I set the meeting in a neutral place, the lawyer's office, a room of polished wood and quiet authority, for I wanted no one to feel the comfort of home or the safety of familiarity, only the presence of order and the weight of legality. I told no one else of my deeper intentions, for secrecy had always been my ally, and I walked into those days leading to the setup with a steady heart, carrying in my cane and my notebook the tools of both age and wisdom. I recall sitting alone the night before, the city glowing beneath me, and whispering to myself that this was not revenge alone but justice, a balancing of the scales that had tilted too far, a reminder that love without respect becomes exploitation, and that I would not allow my sacrifices to be remembered only as a stepping stone for those who mocked me. The setup was not only for them but for me, a way to reclaim my voice, to show that though years had bent my back, they had not broken my will, and that even in the twilight of my days, I still carried the strength to shape my destiny. When the morning of the meeting arrived, I dressed with care, the way a man does when he knows he must face both the past and the future in a single room. And as I looked at my reflection, I saw not just an old man, but the father who had endured, the worker who had built, the planner who had never faltered. And I told myself that by nightfall the truth would stand where silence once lived. The day of the meeting arrived, and as I stepped into the lawyer's office, I carried with me not only the weight of years, but also the certainty of truth, for this was the moment toward which all my planning and patience had been leading, the moment when illusions would crumble and reality would be laid bare. The room was polished and solemn, with books lining the shelves and the faint smell of leather and ink filling the air. And I took my seat with steady hands, knowing that soon my son and his wife would sit across from me. When they entered, her eyes sharp with expectation and his gaze flickering with unease, I greeted them warmly, not as an adversary but as a father, and I invited them to sit, watching how she leaned forward with eagerness, clearly anticipating the announcement of inheritance, while he shifted nervously in his chair as though some part of him sensed what was coming. The lawyer began with a tone of formality, opening the folder that contained documents years in the making, and as he read aloud, I observed every change in their expressions, the hope that flashed in her eyes, the anxious anticipation in his, until the words turned and revealed what they had never expected. Instead of hearing that control of properties and accounts had been passed to them, they heard that ownership remained firmly in my hands, that provisions had been secured to ensure I retained authority over every major decision, and that nothing could be transferred without my explicit consent. I watched as her smile faltered, as her confident posture stiffened, as the color drained slightly from her face, and I saw my son glance at her with confusion, caught between the image he had believed and the reality unfolding before him. The lawyer continued, outlining how trusts had been structured, how legal safeguards prevented misuse, how the very wealth they thought was within reach remained beyond their grasp. And with each word, the silence in the room grew heavier, broken only by the sound of papers being shuffled and pens scratching across the desk. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and I let the silence hang, allowing them to feel the full weight of the truth. And then I leaned forward, my voice calm but unyielding, telling them that the life they enjoyed was not a foundation they had built, but one I had laid, that every step of their comfort was tied to sacrifices they had dismissed, and that I would not allow disrespect or exclusion to erase the years of devotion that had brought us all here. She was the first to break, her words sharp and incredulous, demanding to know how I could keep such power, how I could deny them what was theirs by right, and in that outburst she revealed her heart fully, speaking not of love or family, but of possession and entitlement, and I saw in her eyes the very greed I had long suspected. My son tried to calm her, his voice low and uncertain, but even in his attempt I heard the echoes of doubt, the realization dawning on him that what he had believed was his alone had always been guided by my unseen hand. I let them speak, let their frustration rise, and then I answered with the steady truth, saying that nothing they claimed was owed, that inheritance is not a reward for disrespect, and that until they learned the value of loyalty and gratitude, they would have no control over what I had built. The lawyer nodded, confirming the legality of every word, and I saw the final flicker of arrogance leave their faces as the reality settled in. That was the big reveal, not shouted in anger but spoken in calm authority. A father reclaiming his dignity, a man reminding those who had forgotten that silence does not mean weakness. And as I sat back in my chair, I felt a peace I had not known in months, for the truth had been revealed and there was no turning it back. The silence that followed the lawyer's words did not last long. For once the weight of the truth had settled on their shoulders, it cracked the calm surface they had tried to maintain, and what poured out was not acceptance, but shock and fury, the kind of anger that comes when entitlement is denied and illusions are torn apart. She was the first to rise from her chair, her voice trembling not with sorrow but with outrage, demanding to know how I could sit there with a straight face and deny them what she claimed was already theirs, how I could look at my own son and keep the keys to the fortune she believed had been promised. Her hands clenched into fists on the polished table, and her eyes burned with a kind of fire that revealed more than words ever could. A fire not of love but of greed, not of partnership but of possession, and in her fury I saw the mask fall away completely, leaving only the truth I had long suspected. My son, seated beside her, shifted uncomfortably, his face pale and his lips pressed tight as though caught between two loyalties, and though he tried at first to calm her, his own voice soon broke, rising with a mixture of desperation and frustration, asking why I had not trusted him, why I had kept control when he believed he had earned the right to stand on his own. I listened quietly, letting their fury spill into the air, and I noted how every word they spoke was laced not with gratitude but with demand, not with understanding but with resentment, as though the years I had labored were nothing but an obstacle standing between them and the wealth they desired. The lawyer sat still, his expression steady, but I could see in his eyes that he too recognized the nature of their outburst. For fury is a mirror, and in their anger they revealed their true selves, exposing the greed and impatience that had been hidden beneath polite words. She accused me of manipulation, of cruelty, of holding on to power simply to control them, her voice sharp enough to carry into the hallway beyond, and I saw the staff outside pause in their steps, witnesses to the storm that raged within. My son's voice cracked as he turned to me, not in humility but in accusation, saying that he had worked hard, that he deserved the fruits of my labor, that it was time for me to step aside. And though his words cut deep, I let them sink in without flinching, for I knew they were not born of truth, but of the influence of the woman beside him, whose fury had spilled into him like a poison. In that room their shock transformed into a kind of frenzy, and I remained seated, my cane resting across my lap, my eyes fixed on them not with hatred but with the calm of a man who has endured storms greater than this. And in my silence their fury only grew, for nothing enrages the entitled more than being met with quiet strength. I spoke at last, not to argue, but to remind them of the facts, that nothing in those documents was unjust, that everything had been built by my hand, that control remained with me not to punish but to protect. And I told them that if their words that day were any measure of their readiness, then they had proven exactly why they were not yet fit to inherit. My voice was steady, without anger, but my words cut through their fury like a blade through cloth, and I saw for a moment in my son's eyes the flicker of realization, the faint spark of shame, though it was quickly drowned by the storm stirred by his wife's rage. They left the meeting in a rush, their faces flushed, their voices still raised, slamming the door behind them, and the sound echoed through the office like thunder. But I remained seated, my breathing calm, for though they had left in fury, the truth had been spoken and the world had heard it, and in their shock they had revealed to all present the depth of their greed. After the storm of that meeting, the collapse came swiftly, not with a single blow, but with the steady unraveling of every thread they had woven into their illusion. And I watched from a distance as the life they thought unshakable began to crumble beneath the weight of truth. At first they tried to maintain appearances, striding into the world as though nothing had changed. But whispers spread quickly in circles where reputation is fragile, and soon it became known that the control they had boasted of was never theirs, that the wealth they paraded as security remained beyond their reach, and in those whispers their social standing began to falter. Creditors who once extended generosity turned cautious, sensing instability, and doors that had once opened easily began to close, leaving them to face the reality that their comfort had always rested on foundations they did not own. She grew restless, her sharp words cutting deeper into my son as she pressed him to find ways around my authority, urging him to demand more, to challenge me, to prove himself by seizing what she believed they deserved. But each attempt met the same unmovable truth, that the law and the deeds and the accounts bore my name, and no scheme could alter that. Friends who once surrounded them drifted away, for nothing exposes the nature of relationships more than the loss of perceived wealth. And without the glitter of money to attract them, their circle grew smaller, leaving them isolated in the very city they had once claimed as their kingdom. I heard from acquaintances that arguments filled their home, that her voice rose often in anger, blaming him for failing to secure control, blaming me for holding on too tightly. And in those quarrels their unity began to fracture. For greed is a poor foundation for marriage, and when it is tested, it crumbles quickly. My son, once so confident, began to walk with slumped shoulders, his pride dimmed, his steps heavy, and though part of me ached to see him so, another part knew it was a lesson he had to endure, a reckoning with the truth he had chosen to ignore when he stood silent as his wife dismissed me. Their plans unraveled piece by piece, promises they had made to others falling apart when they could not deliver, and soon even the luxuries they had flaunted began to slip away, the trips, the dinners, the comforts replaced by restraint they had never practiced. It is a strange thing to witness the collapse of what others thought invincible, stranger still when it is your own blood at the center of it. And yet I did not rejoice. For a father cannot find joy in the suffering of his child, even when that suffering is born of arrogance. But I did feel vindicated, for the collapse revealed what I had known all along, that respect cannot be demanded by those who give none, that wealth without gratitude is empty, and that dignity cannot be erased by dismissal. In time, word reached me that even their closest allies had stepped away, unwilling to tie themselves to a couple whose ambitions had been exposed as hollow, and in that isolation they began to taste the bitterness of the very silence they once forced upon me. The city that had once seemed to embrace them now turned indifferent, its bright lights no longer reflecting glory but indifference, and their world shrank to the walls of their strained home. Walls that echoed with the arguments of two people who had thought they could build their future on the back of a man they chose to discard. For me, the collapse was not an end, but a confirmation, proof that the patience I had chosen, the quiet planning I had made, had borne its fruit. And as I walked through the streets with my cane tapping steadily, I carried myself not with triumph, but with peace, knowing that the dignity I had reclaimed stood firm while their illusions lay in ruins. Vindication does not arrive with trumpets or the cheers of crowds. It comes quietly, like the steady sunrise after a long night. And as I watched the pieces of their carefully crafted illusions fall away, I felt a calmness settle over me. For I knew that the sacrifices of my life had not been in vain, and that the dignity they had tried to strip from me had been restored. I did not need to gloat or remind them of their words, for their own actions had already revealed their folly, and the sight of their unraveling was proof enough that arrogance cannot stand against truth. When I walked through the streets of my neighborhood, neighbors who had once looked at me with pity now greeted me with respect, for word had spread of what had transpired, and they understood that I had not been the forgotten father left to fade, but the man who had built the foundation that others had tried and failed to claim. My son could not meet my eyes when we crossed paths, his shoulders bent, his voice low, as though he carried the weight of shame, and though part of me longed to embrace him and erase the distance that greed had carved between us, I knew this season was not meant for comfort but for lessons. Lessons he had to face if he were ever to rise again, as the man I once believed he could be. His wife, once so sharp in her dismissal, no longer carried herself with the same haughty pride, her words clipped and her gaze quick to turn away, for she too understood that the fortress she thought she had claimed was built on ground she could not touch. And though she tried to hide it, I saw the cracks of defeat in her posture. For myself, vindication was not in their downfall but in my own peace, in knowing that I had stood firm, that I had refused to beg for the place that was already mine, that I had shown through patience and truth that a father's worth cannot be erased by cruelty or silence. I reflected often on the long nights of labor, the endless sacrifices, the meals I had foregone, the hours I had bent over machines or carried heavy loads, and I realized that every ounce of pain had been redeemed in this moment, for the wealth and stability I built were not squandered in arrogance, but protected in dignity, and I could now face the evening of my life with the knowledge that I had honored both my promise to his mother and my promise to myself. Vindication also lived in the quiet respect of those who witnessed the truth, the lawyer who nodded with approval as he handed me the final papers, the acquaintances who remarked softly that it was good to see justice done. Even the strangers who looked at me with the subtle recognition reserved for men who have endured trials and come through unbroken. I did not need applause, for the peace in my heart was greater than any praise, and as I sat in my chair at night with the city lights glowing in the distance, I felt a satisfaction deeper than joy. The satisfaction of a man who knows he has not been defeated, who knows his story has not ended in silence but in strength. Vindication is not about proving others wrong. It is about proving to yourself that your path was true. And as I reflected on the long journey that had carried me here, I knew without doubt that I had chosen well, that patience had been my ally, that truth had been my shield, and that dignity had been my reward. Resolution came not in a grand gesture, but in the stillness that followed the storm, a stillness in which I could finally breathe without the weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest. And in that quiet, I found myself reflecting on all that had transpired, the journey from the moment I boarded that plane in secret to the day when truth was laid bare before those who sought to erase me. I had endured silence at the door, cruelty in whispered words, and fury in a meeting where entitlement had screamed louder than love. Yet through it all I had not faltered, I had remained steady, and in the end my steadiness had proven stronger than their schemes. I thought often of my son, and though his choices had cut me deeply, I could not bring myself to hate him, for he was still the boy I once carried on my shoulders, the child who had clutched my hand in trust, and I held on to the hope that perhaps one day he would come to me not with pride or excuses, but with honesty, and that in that moment we might rebuild something truer than what had been lost. As for her, the woman whose sharp words had struck me like arrows, I bore her no vengeance in my heart, for life itself would teach her lessons sharper than any I could deliver. And already the cracks in her confidence had shown me that arrogance does not survive long when built on borrowed ground. In the twilight of my years, I have learned that resolution is not about punishing others, but about reclaiming the peace within yourself. And as I sat in the evenings with my cane resting against my chair and the glow of the city lights shining through the window, I felt that peace settle into me like a long-awaited guest. I no longer needed to prove my worth, for the truth had spoken louder than any words I could utter. And those who once dismissed me now understood that a father's place cannot be erased, that love and sacrifice leave marks stronger than ink, marks that cannot be scrubbed out by cruelty or greed. My journey had been painful, yes, but it had also been necessary, for it reminded me of the strength that still lived in me, the resilience of a man who has walked through fire before and found himself not consumed but tempered. And so, I embraced the resolution with calmness, knowing that while they faced the consequences of their choices, I could finally stand tall in the knowledge that I had done my part, that I had protected not only my legacy but also my dignity, and that the lessons written in my story would endure long after I am gone. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.